It is February 26, 1936, and we are in Tokyo, where snow is falling across the capital in the early morning darkness. It is 5 in the morning, and the city is still asleep, wrapped in the quiet cold of winter. But 1,400 soldiers are already moving through the streets in organized columns. They are not on routine patrol, and they are not responding to any emergency. They are carrying out assassinations, executing a plan that has been months in the making, and government leaders are being hunted inside their own homes right now. Ministers and advisors, men who have served Japan for decades, men who thought they were safe in their beds. By sunrise, Japan's government will be effectively paralyzed. The capital will be in chaos, and the country will stand on the edge of civil war. This is the February 26th incident. The day Japan almost destroyed itself from within, the day when young army officers tried to purify the nation through blood and violence, and the day that would change the course of Japanese history forever. Let's go back to where this all started, back to November 1918, when World War I ended and Japan found itself on the winning side of a global conflict. The economy had boomed during the war years, with shipbuilding, manufacturing, and exports to Europe, while the continent tore itself apart in trenches and battlefields, and Japanese factories worked overtime to supply the Allied powers with everything they needed. But the boom did not last. When the war ended, European factories rebuilt, European workers returned from the front lines, and Japanese exports collapsed almost overnight. The bubble burst hard, with unemployment soaring across the country and wages falling for those who managed to keep their jobs. Rural communities suffered the most as rice prices dropped, and farmers who had barely survived before now could not survive at all. Then came the Great Depression in 1929, when the global economy crashed and Japan got hit especially hard because the country was deeply integrated into international trade networks. Banks failed one after another, businesses closed their doors permanently, and millions lost their jobs. In the countryside, desperate families sold their daughters into prostitution just to afford food for the rest of the family. The government seemed helpless in the face of all this suffering as politicians argued endlessly in the Diet and passed weak reforms that did not address the fundamental problems. The rich kept getting richer through connections and corruption while everyone else starved. And inside the military, young officers were watching all of this with growing rage. These officers came from rural areas, and they were not from wealthy families or the urban elite. They came from the very communities being destroyed by the economic collapse. They watched their families suffer. They watched their villages die. They received letters from home describing hunger and desperation, and when they looked at Tokyo, they saw corruption, weakness, and politicians who seemed to care more about profits and foreign approval than the nation and its people. The sense of loss in the countryside made the officers feel isolated and rural, and it fed a growing anger that demanded action. They began to believe something dangerous. They believed Japan was being betrayed from within by corrupt politicians, greedy businessmen, and Western-influenced liberals who did not understand or respect Japan's destiny. That feeling of betrayal hardened into a conviction that drastic measures were required. At the same time, a new ideology spread through the army like wildfire. It was an ideology of ultranationalism and extreme emperor worship, the idea that Japan had a divine mission in Asia, that the emperor was a god on earth, and that Japan's expansion was not only politically necessary but spiritually ordained. Two factions emerged inside the Imperial Japanese Army, and they represented fundamentally different visions for Japan's future. The Imperial Way faction, known as Kodo-ha, were the radicals and the true believers. They argued that Japan needed spiritual purification before anything else. They wanted direct rule by the emperor, with no parliament to slow things down, no politicians to corrupt the process, and no businessmen profiting from the nation's suffering. They sought the pure divine will of the emperor to guide the nation. The control faction, known as Tosei-ha, were more pragmatic and calculating. They supported military expansion, but they wanted it done through careful planning, through institutions under their control, and through a managed process of state power. The two factions hated each other with a passion that went beyond policy disagreements and into personal hatred. By the mid-1930s, the control faction was winning the internal power struggle. They consolidated control inside the military bureaucracy and systematically pushed Imperial Way officers out through transfers to remote posts, demotions that destroyed careers, and forced retirements that ended influence. The young radical officers felt cornered and desperate, convinced their moment was slipping away. Feeling isolated and betrayed, they decided the only solution left was violence, dramatic action that would shock the nation and force change. The plan would be a public, decisive break with the old order. The core group was small, perhaps 20 officers at most. They were captains and lieutenants in their 20s and early 30s. They were idealistic, fanatical, and absolutely convinced they were saving Japan from destruction. They called their plan the Showa Restoration, a direct reference to the Meiji Restoration of 1868, when samurai overthrew the Tokugawa shogunate and restored the emperor to power. These young officers saw themselves as modern samurai, spiritual warriors who would purify the nation through decisive action. The idea, in its simplest form, was this: Japan had strayed from its divine path because corrupt politicians served foreign interests and capitalists instead of serving the emperor and the people. The military had been infiltrated by pragmatists and traitors who cared more about their careers than the nation's destiny. The only solution, they believed, was to eliminate the corruption violently, to kill the traitors publicly, to clear away the filth that had accumulated, and to restore direct rule under Emperor Hirohito, who would then guide Japan back to its proper path. They genuinely believed this was patriotic. They believed they were the true patriots, while everyone else had been corrupted. Most importantly, they believed the emperor secretly agreed with them. They thought he was being manipulated and controlled by the very advisors they planned to kill. They believed that if they removed these corrupt officials, the emperor would approve of their actions. He would thank them for their loyalty. He would declare the Showa Restoration, and he would remake Japan according to their vision. They were wrong about this, completely and utterly wrong, but they did not know that yet, and they would not find out until it was too late. By early 1936, the plan was finalized and ready to execute, led by Captain Nonaka Shiro, Captain Ando Teruzo, and several other young officers who had spent months quietly recruiting followers from their own units, identifying targets carefully and waiting for exactly the right moment to strike. February 26, 1936, was the moment they had been waiting for, at 5 in the morning. When snow-covered Tokyo lay under a thick blanket of white, and 1,400 soldiers from the 1st and 3rd Infantry Regiments were mobilized and moving through the streets in the pre-dawn darkness. Most of the regular soldiers, the enlisted men carrying rifles through the snow, did not actually know what they were doing. They genuinely thought this was some kind of drill or perhaps special security duty related to the political tensions everyone knew about. But the officers knew exactly what was happening. They split into carefully organized assassination teams, and each team had been assigned a specific target, a specific person who needed to die that morning. These targets had been chosen to represent different aspects of the corruption the officers hated. The first target was Prime Minister Okada Keisuke, who was home asleep in his residence. The second target was Finance Minister Takahashi Korekiyo, the man credited with pulling Japan out of the Depression, but whom the officers hated because he opposed unlimited military spending. The third target was Grand Chamberlain Admiral Suzuki Kantaro, a close advisor to the emperor. The fourth target was Lord Keeper of the Privy Seal Saito Makoto, a former prime minister and another close imperial advisor. The fifth target was Inspector General of Military Education Watanabe Jotaro, one of the leaders of the Control faction, and therefore a traitor in the eyes of the Imperial Way officers. The teams moved through the snow toward their targets. At the Takahashi residence, soldiers broke in at 5:15 a.m. Takahashi was 77 years old, an elderly man who had served Japan for decades. He was in bed when he heard the commotion of soldiers forcing their way into his home. He stood up to see what was happening, probably thinking there was some mistake or some emergency he needed to address. But the soldiers did not hesitate and did not explain anything. They just gunned him down with multiple shots from their rifles. They fired so many rounds into his body that Takahashi was nearly unrecognizable by the time they finished. His wife watched the entire thing happen, but could not do anything to stop it or help him. At the Saito residence, it was almost exactly the same. Soldiers stormed into the house in the early morning darkness. Saito was 78 years old, another elderly statesman. He tried to reason with the soldiers, tried to talk to them and understand what they wanted, but they just shot him in front of his wife without any discussion or negotiation. At Admiral Suzuki's home, the attack was more chaotic and less organized. Suzuki was shot 4 times by soldiers who burst into his bedroom. His wife did something remarkable. She threw herself over his body and begged the soldiers to stop, pleaded with them to show mercy. For some reason, they hesitated. They did not confirm the kill, and they left while Suzuki lay there bleeding and barely alive. He would survive his wounds and live for many more years. At General Watanabe's home, the soldiers broke in around 5:40 a.m. Watanabe confronted them while still in his nightclothes, probably demanding to know what was happening and who ordered this, but they gunned him down without answering any questions. There was blood everywhere in his home. Prime Minister Okada had an almost miraculous escape. When the soldiers arrived at his residence and broke in looking for him, in the confusion and darkness and chaos of the early morning raid, they mistook his brother-in-law for the Prime Minister himself. They killed the wrong man, shot him dead while Okada managed to hide in a bathroom. Later that day, servants who were loyal to him smuggled him out of the house during the funeral preparations for his brother-in-law, so the Prime Minister escaped with his life purely by accident. By 6 a.m., just as the sun was starting to rise over Tokyo, the assassinations were complete. 3 high-ranking officials were dead, 2 more were gravely wounded and might die, and the Prime Minister was missing. 1,400 troops occupied central Tokyo in a coordinated military operation, and they seized key government buildings, including the War Ministry, where military decisions were made, the Metropolitan Police Headquarters, where law enforcement was coordinated, the Prime Minister's residence, which was now a crime scene, and the Diet Building, where the Parliament met. The rebels set up their headquarters in the occupied zone, and then they waited for what they expected to happen next. They issued a manifesto that denounced the corruption of politicians and businessmen in dramatic language, called for a Showa restoration to purify the nation, and demanded that the emperor take direct control of the government and rule without the interference of corrupt advisors. They expected support from other military units who they thought shared their frustrations. They expected the civilian population to rise up and join them once they understood what was happening. And most importantly, they expected the emperor himself to approve their actions and declare the Showa restoration they had fought for. Tokyo woke up that morning to absolute chaos. The government was paralyzed, with 3 cabinet members dead or missing and several more in hiding. Government buildings were occupied by armed troops who would not explain what was happening, and armed soldiers patrolled the streets while civilians tried to figure out what was going on. Ordinary people did not know what was happening and could not get clear information. They wondered if this was a military exercise that had gotten out of control, or a coup attempt against the government, or maybe even a revolution like the ones that had swept through Europe in recent decades. The military leadership itself was split and could not agree on how to respond to the crisis. Some generals quietly sympathized with the rebels. They did not condone the violence or the murders, but they understood the frustration behind it. They agreed that the politicians were corrupt and that Japan needed stronger leadership, and they thought maybe the rebels had a point about purification, even if their methods were wrong. Other generals were horrified by what had happened because this was clear mutiny. This was treason against the state, an attack on the entire chain of command that could not be tolerated under any circumstances. The war minister, General Kawashima Yoshiyuki, tried to mediate between the 2 sides and find some kind of solution that would not require Japanese soldiers to fire on other Japanese soldiers. He was sympathetic to the Imperial Way faction and its ideology, and he hesitated for hours because he genuinely did not want to order troops to fire on fellow soldiers, on young officers who he thought might be patriots even if they had made a terrible mistake. That hesitation cost crucial time and allowed the crisis to drag on. There was one person who was not hesitant at all, who knew exactly what needed to happen, and that was Emperor Hirohito. The emperor woke up on the morning of February 26th to news of the coup. His advisors came to him with reports of the assassinations, the occupied buildings, the dead ministers, and the rebel demands for a Showa restoration. The officers who planned all this expected approval and understanding. They genuinely thought the emperor had been waiting for someone to do exactly what they had done. Instead, Hirohito was furious, absolutely furious in a way that surprised even his closest advisors who knew him as usually calm and measured. He did not see patriots when he looked at what the rebels had done. He saw traitors and murderers. He saw men who had killed his advisors and his friends, men who had violated every principle of military discipline and the chain of command that held the empire together. He did not see a restoration of imperial authority. He saw a rebellion against that very authority. Hirohito summoned his military chiefs immediately. He was not asking for options or advice. He was giving direct orders that could not be questioned or delayed. Suppress the rebellion immediately, use whatever force is necessary, and do not negotiate with traitors. He called the rebels traitors to his military chiefs. He refused to meet with any of them or hear their explanations, and he refused to consider their demands for political changes. This changed everything. The young officers had based their entire plan, their whole strategy, on one fundamental assumption that turned out to be completely wrong. They thought he was being manipulated by corrupt advisors, and that once those advisors were removed, once the corrupt politicians were gone, he would see the truth and approve of their actions. But the emperor did not approve, and he did not see the truth the way they imagined. Instead, he condemned them in the strongest possible terms. Without imperial support, without the emperor's blessing, the coup was doomed from that moment forward. But the rebels did not surrender immediately after they learned of the emperor's fury. For 3 long days, Tokyo was paralyzed in a strange standoff as 1,400 armed soldiers occupied the government district. Barricades went up at major intersections, and machine gun nests were positioned at key locations. Officers in command positions refused to stand down or negotiate. The army surrounded them with loyal troops, with tanks brought in from nearby bases, and with artillery positioned to fire on the occupied buildings if necessary. But nobody wanted to actually open fire because these were Japanese soldiers facing other Japanese soldiers, brothers and friends and men from the same regiments who had trained together and fought together. The military leadership tried negotiation and sent mediators to talk with the rebel officers, hoping to find some way to end this without bloodshed. But the rebels refused every offer and every compromise. They demanded the Showa restoration. They demanded fundamental political reforms. They demanded that the emperor recognize their loyalty and their service to the nation. And they wouldn't accept anything less than complete victory. The emperor refused everything they asked for and made it clear there would be no negotiation with traitors. By February 27th, the standoff became clearer. The rebels controlled part of Tokyo, but they were completely isolated from any support. No other military units had joined them despite their expectations. The navy was loyal to the emperor and opposed the army coup. The police were loyal and waiting for orders to move in. Even most of the army was loyal once they understood that the emperor had condemned the rebels. The rebels were alone, surrounded, and running out of options. The government used psychological warfare against them. Radio broadcasts blanketed the city with messages carefully directed at the rebel soldiers, not the officers who had planned this, but the regular troops, the enlisted men who had thought this was a drill or legitimate orders. Your officers have deceived you and lied to you. This is rebellion against the emperor himself. Return to your barracks immediately and you will not be punished. Your officers are traitors to the nation. Do not follow traitors into disgrace and death. Leaflets were dropped from planes over the occupied zone, carrying the same message. The leaflet said the emperor himself commands you to stand down, Return to your barracks and face no punishment. This is not patriotism or service. This is treason against everything you swore to protect. Family members were brought to the barricades by the government in a calculated move. Mothers and wives and sisters pleaded with the soldiers to come home, to leave this madness before it was too late, to think about their families and their futures. The rebels started to crack under this pressure as the regular soldiers began to understand what they'd actually been part of, and they realized they'd been deceived and used for a rebellion against the emperor himself. By February 28th, it was effectively over as the regular soldiers began deserting in small groups at first, and then in larger numbers, slipping away from the barricades when their officers weren't watching, going back to their barracks and turning themselves in and abandoning the officers who had led them into this disaster. The officers realized they had lost everything. Their plan had failed, their soldiers were deserting, and the emperor had condemned them as traitors. Some of them considered suicide as the only honorable way out, and some considered fighting to the death in a final glorious stand. But they were surrounded by overwhelming force and outnumbered by loyal troops, and the emperor had personally condemned them and ordered their suppression. On February 29th, the last rebels finally surrendered without any final battle or last stand, and 1,400 troops returned to their barracks while the officers were arrested and led away. There was no final battle, no last stand against impossible odds, just quiet surrender in the snow. The crisis was over after 3 days of tension and fear, but Japan was changed forever by those 3 days. Trials began in the summer of 1936 as the rebel officers faced courts-martial and military tribunals that would decide their fate. The hearings were closed to the public because the government did not want the rebels' ideology spreading to more young officers or to the civilian population. 17 officers were sentenced to death for their roles in planning and executing the coup, and they were executed by firing squad quickly and quietly, without any public spectacle or martyrdom. Others received long prison sentences, and some would spend decades behind bars. Their careers and lives were effectively over. But here is the strange and ironic part that changed everything about what the coup meant. Many Japanese civilians actually sympathized with the rebels even after learning what they had done. Not with the murders, obviously, and not with the violence and the violation of law. Rather, they sympathized with the underlying anger and frustration that had driven the officers to such desperate action, and with the sense that Japan really had lost its way and that someone needed to do something dramatic to fix it. The countryside especially felt this sympathy because the same rural poverty that had radicalized the officers was real and getting worse every year. The same inequality that enraged them was visible everywhere you looked, and the same corrupt politicians they hated were still in power and still enriching themselves. So even though the coup failed militarily and the rebels were executed or imprisoned, their message resonated with millions of Japanese people, and the military leadership took notice of this popular sentiment. This is where the real irony begins, and where the February 26th incident becomes truly important for understanding what came next. The February 26th incident was meant to be a purification of Japan, a Showa restoration to install direct imperial rule and end corrupt civilian government forever. Militarily, it failed completely, but in failing, it achieved something the rebels never intended and probably never imagined, and that was a lasting weakening of civilian government in Japan. Politicians were absolutely terrified after February 26th because 3 cabinet members had just been murdered in their own homes in the early morning, and the military had proved it could reach anyone and assassinate anyone at any time, no matter how high-ranking or how well protected. Politicians became far more cautious and far more accommodating to military demands. They stopped opposing military budgets or questioning military operations. They stopped advocating for restraint or for diplomatic solutions. Military budgets increased dramatically after February 26th. Expansion plans that had been debated moved forward without opposition, and voices calling for restraint or for peace were silenced or marginalized. The Control faction won the internal army power struggle, and the Imperial Way faction was purged from positions of influence. But the Control faction did not oppose expansion or militarism. They wanted to control and to manage it, to direct it through official channels. Japan moved steadily toward war after February 26th in a way that might not have been possible before. In 1937, the Marco Polo Bridge incident provided the excuse for a full-scale invasion of China. In 1940, Japan signed the Tripartite Pact with Germany and Italy, and formally joined the Axis. In 1941 came the attack on Pearl Harbor, which brought America into the war. The path from February 26, 1936 to World War II was remarkably direct, and the connections are clear. The coup failed, but the coup's ideology prevailed. Militarism became the dominant force in Japanese politics. Expansionism became national policy that could not be questioned. The belief grew that Japan had a divine mission in Asia, that civilian government was weak and corrupt, and that only military force could solve Japan's problems at home and abroad. All of that survived February 26th, all of that spread through Japanese society, and all of that shaped the catastrophic decisions that led to World War II. So here's the question we have to ask. What if the coup had actually succeeded? What if the emperor had supported the rebels instead of condemning them? What if the Showa restoration had happened the way the young officers imagined? The immediate result would likely have been military dictatorship, not gradual influence, but immediate and total military control of government with no civilian opposition possible. The emperor would have been a figurehead, a divine symbol the new rulers could point to, while real power rested with the military officers, specifically the young radicals who had staged the coup and proved their loyalty through violence. Would they have been competent rulers capable of managing a complex modern nation? Almost certainly not. These were idealistic officers in their 20s with no experience governing anything, little understanding of economics beyond vague anger at capitalism, no diplomatic skills, and no real international experience. They had passion and loyalty and an unshakable belief in spiritual purification. They would have made big, devastating mistakes, and those mistakes would have had grave consequences. Internal opposition would have emerged pretty quickly because the Control faction officers who got pushed aside would not have accepted radical rule quietly. The Navy would not have accepted army domination without a fight, and various political factions would have resisted the new order in whatever ways they could. Internal Japan might have descended into actual civil war, with army units fighting Navy units, radicals fighting conservatives, and different visions of what the Showa restoration meant clashing violently in the streets. Civil war. Or maybe the radicals would have consolidated power more quickly and more brutally than we imagine, eliminating all opposition before it could organize effectively, purging anyone who questioned them. In that case, Japan's military expansion would have been even more aggressive and even more reckless than what actually happened, with no restraint at all, no pragmatism or calculation, just fanatical belief in Japan's divine destiny and the need to spread that destiny through conquest. Brutal. The war with China might have started earlier and been even more brutal than it was. The decision to attack Pearl Harbor might have come sooner and been even less carefully calculated, and Japan might have burned even brighter as an imperial power, and then collapsed even faster under the weight of its own ambitions. Pearl Harbor. We cannot know for sure what would have happened in this alternate history, but we know this much: the February 26th incident was absolutely a turning point in Japanese history. Not because the coup succeeded, but because it failed in a very specific way that changed everything that came after. Turning point. It failed militarily, but it terrified the civilians who might have opposed militarism. It failed to achieve the Showa restoration, but it energized the military and gave them effective control anyway. It failed to change the government immediately, but it set Japan on an irreversible path toward total war. Let us come back to where we started at the beginning of this story. It is February 26, 1936, and snow is falling across Tokyo while 1,400 soldiers move through the streets in the pre-dawn darkness as government leaders are being murdered in their own homes by young officers who think they are saving the nation. Snow Tokyo. By sunrise, Japan's government is paralyzed and the country stands on the edge of civil war, and 3 days later, after a tense standoff, the coup collapses. The rebels surrender quietly in the snow, and the emperor's authority holds. The country does not tear itself apart that week, and the crisis ends without the full-scale civil war that seemed possible. But the damage is done in ways that will not become clear for years. Authority. The seeds of World War II are planted in the snow of February 26th, not because the coup succeeded in its immediate goals, but because even in failure it proved something important to everyone watching. It proved that violence works as a political tool, that fear works to control politicians, that the military could intimidate civilians into submission, and that expansion and militarism were inevitable forces that could not be stopped. Seeds. The young officers who staged the coup and paid for it with their lives believed absolutely that they were saving Japan from corruption and decay. They believed in loyalty above all else, in sacrifice for the nation, and in purification through violence. They genuinely thought the emperor would approve of their actions once he understood their pure motives, and they died believing they had served their country faithfully. Loyalty. They were wrong about all of it, completely and tragically wrong, but their ideas did not die with them on the execution ground. Their ideas spread through the military and through society. Their ideas won converts and believers, and their ideas shaped the next decade of Japanese history in catastrophic ways. Ideas. 9 years later, Japan would lie in absolute ruins, with cities burned to the ground, 2 atomic bombs dropped on civilian populations, unconditional surrender to foreign powers, and millions dead, both Japanese and Asian victims of Japanese aggression. The February 26th incident did not directly cause World War II, and we cannot draw a straight line from one to the other, but it was definitely a warning sign that went unheeded, a symptom of the disease that was already spreading through Japan's political system like a cancer. That disease was not cured on February 29, 1936, when the rebels surrendered. It was just temporarily suppressed and driven underground, and it would resurface again and again in different forms until it finally was consumed by the flames of war. So when we look back at February 26, 1936 from our perspective decades later, we are not just looking at a failed coup attempt or an interesting historical footnote. We are looking at the moment when Japan's future became clear to anyone who was willing to see it. The moment when the path to war became inevitable and irreversible. The moment when loyalty to the emperor became indistinguishable from fanaticism. When patriotism became extremism without limits. And when soldiers sworn to protect the nation became assassins murdering government officials in their homes. The government officials being murdered in their beds thought this was about them personally, but it was actually about the death of civilian authority in Japan. History turns on moments like this, on decisions made in crisis, on miscalculations and failures as much as on successes. February 26, 1936 was one of those moments, and Japan would never be the same.